to a new episode of Tell Muses Season 2. This is a podcast created by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers, and anyone interested in the art of the oral word. So today we have with us one of the young generation storytellers I recently met in Gaui, Get a Word in Edgeways Festival, Kestrel, Morton. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Kes! Yay!
Welcome.
Hello, it's lovely to be here, and I'm desperately drinking my coffee as fast as possible, so I'll have good things to say.
Our listeners know that we torture storytellers very early in the morning by doing this.
If we did this at 4 a.m, I would be fine. If we stay up late at night, I'll be on roll. I'm now trying to kind of grind my 4 a.m. brain into action.
So, first of all, where are you located right now?
Right now, I'm in my caravan in South Wales, or as I like to call it, the saggy bottom of South Wales. If you look on a map, you'll see the bit that sort of hangs down right at the bottom in the Vale of Glamorgan, west of Cardiff, east of Swansea.
And is that where you come from?
I grew up in Leeds. I moved to Bristol for university. I ran away from university and lived in Forest of Dean, and now I'm here. A kind of long process of bouncing around different places. This is where I've currently found myself. It's actually the longest place I've lived since I left home. Yeah, there's a sea over there and there's mountains over there.
Sounds idyllic, to be honest. So, Simona, I heard Kestrel tell in Gaui last October 25. They also go by the name of the Ragged Storyteller, which is an alias that suits them perfectly, to be honest, because they do come in this artistic appearance. And what I was impressed by was the whole bodily movement, which I'm sure you very well resonate with, being Italian and all. So do you have a question for Kes, Simona?
I do, actually. I didn't know you before Despina told me that we would interview you. And my first question for you is actually about your name. So Kestrel is the name of a bird. So did you choose your own name? Did your parents choose this name for you? How did it work? And what's the story behind the name, if there is a story?
I mean, it's a very long story. It's actually part of the show that Despina saw me perform at Gaui. I don't mention it in the show itself, but it's a very long story. But during that journey, the show is all about my experiences with psychosis, in which I kind of went through the underworld and the other world and took a long time trying to find my way back home afterwards. And I kind of explored a realm of myth and legend. But during that journey, I realized that kind of the person I'd been died, and I needed to find a new name and new identity to take on myself. So the name came out of that. It's actually a favorite character from a book I'd read as a child, and I'd always really liked the name. And as a kid, I'd always be like, I want to write a story with that character name because I really liked it. And at some point I went, no, that could be my name. But I don't tell people that very often. If you asked me on the street, I'd have given you 5 different answers and then none of them would have been true. It's one of those things that having a strange name, people always want to ask you. It's a funny one because if your name is Jack, no one would ever ask you, so Jack, did your name come from your parents? And you could change your name to Jack from something interesting, and everyone would just naturally assume that Jack was the name that your parents, because who would pick the name Jack? That's where Kestrel comes from. It comes from this need to find a person having lost who I'd been. And it also relates a bit to my identity, my gender identity. I didn't want a gendered name, and Kestrel was this name that the book was a female character, and I kind of like the fact it is a name that could be male, it could be female, it dances in between the two.
Well, Kes, I'm still coping with coming to terms with gender fluidity nowadays, because I've lived on this earth like for half a century, and things were very, very different when I was your age. We didn't have a choice, really. It would either be male, female, or gay. No in betweens, right? It was very, very limited. So, of course, I understand how a person cannot feel comfortable in their own skin or do not feel the need to be placed in any specific category. This has limitations, of course. I try to remember how to use they. It sounds much more inclusive than limiting a person's identity, I'd say. And this is a huge thing nowadays, even though it doesn't have necessarily to do with sexual orientation. This is how I take it. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, gender and sexuality are two kind of separate strands that, often interweave in terms of people with different genders might have different sexualities, but it's not at all a given. Your gender is something that's related to how you see yourself in the spectrum of male, female, both, neither, either or other. I don't tell lots of people my pronouns. It tends to be something I do it when I'm performing because you want to get up on stage and be introduced in the way that you feel. But if I meet people randomly anywhere and everywhere, I tend to just wait before I bother to do the whole pronoun thing because it sometimes gets in the way of a conversation. And I don't know if I'm going to meet that person again. And I usually wait till it's someone I've met, I know, I feel like I trust. We live in an age where actually, I've faced abuse for presenting myself in different ways. I've had death threats in my life for being different. I kind of wait until I go, okay, this person deserves my pronoun. They can have it. And that's, for me, it's a sign of respect. And I really also don't mind people getting it wrong. For me, it's like someone getting it wrong and going, oh, sorry, that shows that they are still trying. It's something that if you've not practiced, it does take a lot of practice to get used to using a they pronoun. And then once you get really good at it, you start using it for everyone because it's easier that than thinking which pronoun does that person use, which is something I'm guilty of. I often automatically they people without thinking about it. It's actually something I've recommended to lots of storytellers, which is that if you are interested in understanding the they pronoun, the non-binary pronoun, which usually applies to non-binary people, not gender fluid people. To me, I had a no response to the question, what's your gender? No. Is write a story or create a story or de-gender one of the characters in your stories. I do it with Jack a lot. Jack changes gender for me all the time because Jack's a great character. Why does Jack have to stick as a boy? Try tell a story where the character's got a they pronoun. You will learn how to use it by telling a story. And if it becomes part of your repertoire, that will really teach you how that you use the pronoun. Also how complicated it sometimes can be, because sometimes if you've got two gender neutral characters, both with they pronouns, it can get very confusing to work out who is who in a scene if they're doing this and they're doing that. And you have to learn when to put in the name and when to put in the pronoun. In the same way as like if you had two he's, you wouldn't be like he did this and then he said that and he did that. You'd have to throw in a name here and there, like learning how you use a pronoun to keep an audience's attention on exactly who is doing what at which point. And once you've learned it, it becomes very intuitive. Gender is definitely different from sexuality. My sexuality, I identify as queer. It's kind of vaguely anyone that I'm attracted to, really. And that doesn't really attach to bodies too strongly. You can be non-binary and attracted to the people that people would assume you'd be attracted to based on your body type, or attracted to the opposite people, or attracted to no people and be asexual.
It might be easier for storytellers, because you don't have necessarily to do with pronouns or names. You can simply change your voice if you have the skill. It could be as simple as that. But yeah, calling everybody they surely simplifies things. And I think it creates a new mindset. It creates a new synapses in the brain. Simona and I teach languages, English as a foreign language. So to teach that to young kids, probably teenagers would get it. I'm not sure children would. Children have to learn how to differentiate genders at first and then move on to the next step, I think.
In my experience, children very much get it, particularly even when they're still coming to terms with gender. All you need to be doing is adding one more thing in, and they get the concept very simply because they're still in that state of learning what things are. So not assuming there is. It's actually the later on you get, it's adults who have the problem with it because they've had long years of their life telling them that there's this A or B. As a language term, it dates back to at least the 1600s. I can't remember the exact date of the earliest use of singular they, but it is actually a very established part of the English language. We don't really think about it because we think about the plural there. But the analogy I'd use, for example, is imagine you're driving in a car and there's someone in front of you. You can't see them, and the driver in the car in front of you turns left, and you'd say, oh, they turned left. They start indicating. You automatically would use that. You wouldn't say he or she turns left, just automatically say, oh, they're turning left now. Like if you were trying to describe what they're doing. When you don't know the pronouns of a person, singular, you will often revert to singular use of the word they as a standard. And it basically means person that I don't know. You know it's a single person, but you don't know what their pronouns are. And when you think about it that way and think of the usages you might have used in that context, it starts to become quite easy because you realize you've been doing it all along.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Also from point of view of an Italian speaker, we do have lots of differentiations between female and male, also in the words that we say. So we've got different articles, different endings, which is different to what you have in English, for example. And what I find myself doing a lot, and I know it's not the usual thing for a native English speaker, for example, when I tell stories about animals, I usually go with the gender that I know with the Italian word. So, for example, if I've got pig, the pig is il maiale in Italian, which is a male word, and I would go with he. Or if I've got a cow, I would go with she. So on and so forth with the genders of the animals in Italian, because my brain just works like this. I find myself giving genders to animals, even if in the story I don't need a gender for the animal, just because my brain works with this distinction of the articles that I would use for the animals in Italian. And so even if I'm telling a story in English, I use that gender for that animal. And I sometimes had some English native speakers asking me, why is this animal a female in your story? And I just go like, because the name in Italian is either a female or male in the gender. My brain works like this. But what you said about using they, them for people that we don't know the gender of, that completely makes sense. For example, when we say everyone is doing their own thing, we use the singular with everyone and then they, them as the articles. It makes complete sense. But what do you do, for example, with animals? So you're an English native speaker, so you don't have this distinction in your brain about articles. Do you genderize animals?
Entirely depends on the story, to be honest, and whether there's a need for a gender, whether there isn't a need for gender, whether there's a gender in the original story, whether I want to change the gender. I find myself sometimes naturally gendering an animal without really thinking about it on what feels like the right gender for the story. And then sometimes I question that and I'll switch it over. So there's one I tell, King of the Birds, which is the competition of where the birds are all trying to decide who's going to be the king. And the wren wins by riding on the eagle's back. And it was male because it was a story about kings. And recently I just went, it can be a woman. The bird can be a woman and they can be a king. And that's what it is now, just to play with it. Often, if it's very like archetypical characters, sometimes I won't gender them at all and just name them like Fox. And Fox is just Fox. In the same way as we're playing with gender neutrality, I quite like the kind of things that are themselves. If gender isn't relevant, you can just completely remove gender from the story because it's not a relevant aspect of their character. Their relevancy is, I am the fox, you know. I mean, I find languages so fascinating. The languages that are very heavily gendered have had lots of difficulties trying to find ways to create non-binary gender-neutral terms. In Italian, in Spanish, I think it's quite similar. Welsh does not have an easy way to be gender neutral. English is actually quite an interesting language on that front, is that we have had a term for centuries now that works for this purpose, and we don't gender our things. And I find the gendering of things really fascinating. Some languages just arbitrarily went, table, that's a man, chair, that's a woman, you know, like who sat down and did this? Like someone at some point in your history was deciding all the genders of all the things based on their gut instinct of, this is what it is. And then you're kind of stuck with it. And then you have to also know everything. Like every time you learn a new word, you have to learn its gender as well. For me, that's such a mind-boggling concept that things would instinctively have this extra component, and it makes language so much more complicated because of the adjectives and the verbs and everything relating to that. Every construction of every sentence gets changed by what objects are in the sentence, which is just, to me, it's alien the way I learn language, which I can do whatever I want with the sentence and mix the words up, switch them around. They don't change each other vastly in how they come out.
It's different in Greek because many words, especially nouns, do come with a gender. So, you know, if it's fox in Greek language, it's going to be female, or if it's elephant, it's going to be male. And it's really when we meet the opposite sex in the story, you know, when the elephant gets to be a she, it's not what you would expect. Or when the first time I heard Mr. Fox's tale, it was like, in all Greek stories, foxes are always girls, and they're either slimy or cunning, or they have these attributes of outwitting other animals, stealing their food, and maybe you've heard the Aesop's tales. But it is different in Greek because there is a neutral gender in singular. So, for example, pig, you said earlier, Simona, it's to guruni, which makes it neither a male nor a female, and you can use to and still have singular adjectives and verbs and everything, For example, the baby is tomoro in Greek, so first time I saw a sentence with baby and then he was hungry, I was like, oh, babies have genders in other languages, right? Or kid as well. Apparently, to Greek people's mind, up to a certain age, up until puberty, you didn't get to be gender assigned. Well, there would be the girl or the boy, yeah, but the article and the noun being used would be neutral. And then all of a sudden, when you hit puberty, you become either he or she. So there is a fluid period before that.
That's really interesting. That kind of almost relates to the kind of the trans approach of like, it's when you become an adult that you're kind of actually in the process of then coming out into the world and saying, this is how I want to be seen. Until that point, you're a kid. Gender is, in many references, not necessarily applicable there at all. It's only when you become an adult and you can go and get married and appear to the world that you kind of have that transitionary process into becoming a gendered thing at all. It's funny you mentioned the fox, actually, because British folklore and quite a lot of European folklore, which is why interesting. The Greek is obviously female. Is fox is almost always male. Mr. Fox, Reynard the Fox. There's a lot of folklore that has fox as a male character in this kind of part of the world, which it doesn't really need to be. It just happens to have been written that way. There's lots of fox stories from around here. We have a kind of the tradition of shape-shifting foxes in the Vale of Glamorgan, which I started looking into it because I knew the bits of folklore. Foxes are really interesting because they're one of the few animals that appears in pretty much every different culture's folk traditions. And because foxes, they are one of the few other animals apart from us that have conquered the globe, and they exist in every continent apart from Antarctica. So they've evolved pretty much entirely alongside us as scavengers and things. And we've become very familiar with these outside creatures that never quite got tamed. They never got brought into the fold, but they were always just outside the fold. And they're almost always shapeshifters. Like the fox character is this kind of shape-shifting trickster creature. And it pops up here in Wales, but you have your Japanese kitsukuni and you have your kind of Native American shape-shifting foxes and African ones, and they just go all the way around the world. This idea of this character that's this shifting thing that might be right next to you and you wouldn't notice.
People who are listening cannot see, Simon and I can't see, but I will share this with our listeners. Describing this, Kes was moving his shoulders around like in the process of shape-shifting himself. This is what I was mentioning earlier, Simona, if you remember, about using the whole body. And do you think, after all this intriguing talk, it might be time for a story?
I could give you a story about foxes if you like. I've always got a story about foxes on the tip of my tongue. Anyone who's listening will have to imagine all the movements. I really like moving when I'm telling stories. I like dancing, and for me, stories is a bit of a dance, and you can really feel the character more when you get your body into it. And I did do a workshop with a dancer once to really, really draw out that movement. That's story, okay. Amser maith yn ôl, which is how we start a story in Wales a long, long time ago. In the Vale of Glamorgan, out on Witch's Point, a great spur of rock that sticks out into Amor Havran, the Severn Sea, which some people call the Bristol Channel. Out there, with Southern Down Beach to the west, and the great rocky cliff of Traeth Mawr to the east, sat old Mother Fox at the mouth of her den looking out into the storm, because it was a dark, stormy night. The rain lashed down, the lightning crashed, and the sea was rising and writhing with white foam, horses running out there in the distance, and the ships The tall ships were turning and spinning, and their lanterns were glinting. And she shivered with the hunger in her belly. It had been a hard winter, a cold winter, a winter of black ice and hail. There was nothing to eat, no crops growing, no plants at all, no berries left. All the birds had eaten them. No birds to eat, no beasts to eat. Everything had fled and hidden. And she looked at the storm. And she looked back at her den, 13 little cubs, all shivering, all as thin as she was. And old Mother Fox decided it was time. Time to do the thing that she had been putting off for many months now. So she gathered the children. And in the back of the den, she pulled out a great wooden chest. She opened it up. And one by one, Mother Fox and her 13 children peeled off their skins and placed them in the box, and underneath those skins stepped humans, ragged humans, humans with blue eyes and ginger hair, putting on patchwork clothes that they'd hidden in that box, swapping fur for rags. And the ragged family began to walk up the lane to the village of Wick, where they knocked on the doors. Please, sir, have you got any food, sir? Please, anything at all, clothes, anything. We are starving. Do you have anything? Well, one by one, those doors shut in their face. Some people would be apologetic. I'm sorry, I would give if I could, but I can't, so I won't. Some people said, not today. If you'd come yesterday, I would have had plenty to share, but not today. Some people would sneer, get off my doorstep, dirty beggar, whatever the excuse. At the end of that day, that long, hard day of begging, old Mother Fox had in her hand 7 copper coins. Just enough, not for food, not for clothes, just enough for one thing. So she took those coins, went to the shop, and she bought candles. A pack of candles. She gave 1 candle to each of her children, had them stand along the top of the cliff of Traeth Mawr, lit those candles, and said the magic words, Tan, 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 and as those flames caught, they flared up and up, brighter and brighter, flickering and dancing and multiplying, until it looked like there was a city on the top of the cliff. Then she went down to Witch's Point. She took a seagull's feather and she began to stir the clouds in the sky until they grew heavy and thick and black, and the wind was howling and the bellies of them ready to burst. Then a branch of driftwood. She did the same to the sea, stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring until the white foam was crashing, the waves were riding high, the horses running out there, out there, out there. She took a blackthorn point, took that little sharp point, and she threw it up into the sky. It pierced the pregnant bellies of the clouds, and the ice and the hail and the rain lashed down. And last, she took her flint and tinder, and she set a spark in the sky. Tan, 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 and those sparks caught, and lightning like spears pierced the sea. Now, out in Amor Havran, out in the Seven Sea, the tall ships were sailing, the tall ships with fat bellies full of rum and spices, sugar, tobacco, good things stolen from far away in the new world. And as they sailed, suddenly the storm hit them hard and hit them fast, and their sails were being brought in, and they were looking left and right and left and right. Where is a port? We need safe harbor. This storm will wreck us. They looked left, they looked right, they saw the lights. Turn, they said, turn here. There is the port. One by one, those ships turned into Well, Clyth Mawr is a tall cliff. The beach below it is not sand but rock. And hidden just beneath the waves there is a sandbar, a great line of sand, an arch, a spine waiting under the water to crack, 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 crack the great ships. And one by one they broke, and were scattered across the beach. Morning came, and in the morning, Mother and her children, they walked down the beach with the clubs in their hands, just making sure that there were no survivors. And once they made sure there was no survivors, they got the barrels, the rum, the spices, the tobacco, the sugar. They put them in the caves under the cliff, and then they walked back up the lanes of the Vale of Glamorgan, knocking on the fine houses, the inns and the manors, saying, "Good sirs, would you have a coin for us? We have some fine produce, very good prices, the best you'll find anywhere in the whole land." And so they sold all their good wares, the rum and the spices and the sugar and the tobacco. They made lots of money. They bought plenty of food, warm clothes, and all winter long they were in comfort beneath the cliff. And any time they ran out of food, ran out of coins, they would simply light the candles and wreck another round of ships. Spring came, and with the spring, the birdsong and the flowers, and with the flowers came the sound of hooves on the cliff top. The excisemen, the lawmen, come looking for what they had heard of wreckers operating in the area. "Mother, mother, mother, it's time, it's time." When the lawmen entered the cave, they found the broken barrels, the remains of all the stolen goods, a few scattered coins. But they didn't see the family of foxes running back to their den, away out on Witch's Point. So, if this winter, in the cold and the dark, you get a knock at the door and some ginger beggars come asking for anything at all, any food, anything really, give them what you can, because if you don't, they might go wreck some ships. And if you live inland, they might go onto the motorway and turn over a lorry or two. And that's my tale.
Brilliant. Last episode, we interviewed Shane Ibs, and Despina said that you were one of the storytellers who transported her into this realm of imagination. So she could imagine everything you said when you told the story. Now I understand what she said. And the second thing is that this summer I went on a long bike ride throughout the UK. And one of the things that I did was crossing the Bristol Channel on the long bridge. I'm sure you know that long bridge. And when you were talking about the wind, I could just imagine the wind because it's something like, I don't know, 2-3 kilometers, even more. So it took us a long time to cross the bridge. And all the time there was the wind blowing and blowing and blowing. And it was hard to pedal on our bikes and cross the channel on the bridge. When you were talking about the wind and the ships, I could just imagine the wind and feel the wind, both from the experience, but also from what you were saying. So it was just very, very nice. Thank you.
And now I keep
There's a
thinking
really-
to myself, one day the Wellerman come to bring sugar and tea and rum.
That's funny. So that song's actually set in a completely different part of the world, New Zealand. And it's about whalers out on their ships. And the Wellerman they sent a ship of relief to go to the whaling fleets and deliver them stuff.
And it was the stuff stolen from the New World.
Oh yeah, still the same stolen stuff. Everybody got rich on back then. There's a lot of shipwrecks that have been on the coast around here. And you still find bits of the sort of bones of the ship sticking up. One of the most interesting historical stories I found when looking up the history of all the shipwrecks, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them, because the Severn is actually it's one of the highest tidal ranges in the world, and it's the most dangerous crossing because of the currents. There was one where a ship ran aground in East Aberthaw, which used to be a port. It's not now because they diverted the river for the power plant that they built there. But this ship ran aground and broke open, and the network of people in that area was so advanced, even back in the 1800s, that within a few hours, 3,000 people had turned up with axes and tools, and they broke open the ship. And then they had a party on the beach for the next 3 days because the ship was full of rum. So they're just drinking all this rum and smoking loads of tobacco. And the law turned up to try and stop it. And the lawmen got chased away by a huge crowd of people. Like, now we're having a party. And eventually 3 people drowned because they were really drunk and they were trying to get more barrels out of the ship. And that's basically the party ended when they'd finished drinking everything. There's a few places where there are supposedly caves that are bricked up on the beach, the old smuggling caves. And there's various rumors about which pub they specifically come out into. Basically, everywhere there's a good bit of cliff, there's a cave, and everywhere there's a cave, it's a bricked up passageway. And everywhere nearby, there's an old pub that's most likely got some kind of secret trapdoor in the floor.
I've heard stories like that before from the southwestern part of England. So apparently the western part of England would be the place where all the harbours where ships from the New World would come, obviously. And I've heard different stories about people smuggling goods or, shipbreaking boats on purpose. And I've also seen a film, I think, where the priest was in it, part of the gang that did the whole thing. So this story, is it a traditional Welsh
story I just told?
Mm-hmm.
There was a folklorist in this area called Mary Trevelyan, or Mary Trevelyan. I never know if it's Mary or Mary. She lived until the end of the 1800s. I think she died in about 1920, but don't quote me on that. And she wrote some amazing sources for the folklore of South Wales, particularly Vale of Glamorgan, where she lived, because she lived in just the town that's a mile that way. She's got a blue plaque on one of those blue plaques saying she was born here and lived here. She has a quite complicated history of her life. She got married to a Frenchman and moved to France, only to discover that her husband was actually already married. So she came back home, but then her family rejected her because she was pregnant. So she moved back home to this part of Wales as a single mother, raising her child in the late 1800s. And she became a fortune teller, and she was also kind of storytelling at the same time. And then she got a contract to write a book of stories of the area for the train line as a travel book. So she wrote one of the first, here are the myths of Wales, get on the train and come and see them kind of books. And that seemed to have made a living. But one of the books she wrote wasn't that. It's just this huge tome of every single bit of folklore she could possibly ever imagine, written down in the least amount of detail possible, in the sense like there's stories, but the stories are rarely more than a paragraph long at most. Like most of the stories are just the outline of a story, like the bones. She doesn't put any flavor that you don't need without any detail. It's just like, there was a story about shipwrecking in this area and they said the foxes did it. So I get a lot of ideas from those. The raw material's there, the idea is there. And there's a few different versions of the shape-shifting foxes in the Vale. Some versions say that they could only shapeshift once a year or twice a year on a certain day. There's another version where the foxes were actually local humans who get given a potion by a witch who lived down the road, and she gave them a potion to turn into foxes so they could escape from the lawmen when they were wrecking. And there's another one with another witch fox in a different area. So there's all these different lovely, slightly contradicting stories, which gives you a lot more freedom because you know that they didn't agree with themselves back then. So you can make a version that doesn't necessarily quite agree. I've made a few more of my own. That one was based on her theme, but again, the story that was written down wasn't really a story. It was just the idea of a story that they did this, that I was like, okay, let's come up with a spell. Witch's Point has another witch, and I can't remember the name of the witch of Witch's Point. So there's like 2 different witch stories. Yeah, we've got a lot of witches here, a lot of shapeshifters. We've got boys who turn into frogs, women who turn into snakes, swan women. Pretty much every animal you can imagine gets turned into a human at some point, or turns from a human into the animal. If anyone wants to read the folklore of South Wales, it's available freely online on the archive.org, which is like the massive internet archive of everything that ever existed. I just use that. I can use the search function on my phone to just, if I'm like, I want a story about this specific thing, I just search the word in there. And usually Mary Trevelyan's like, oh yeah, they had a ritual in this area where shoes were put on a stick and danced around the house. I just made that one up, but there's loads of like little customs that are recorded. It's not just the stories, it's like every custom you could imagine, every bit of like superstition. A friend just had a baby, and I went through the thing listing all the different things that the folklore about babies. For example, what was that one? If you wean a baby late, then they will grow up to be a swearer and they'll just have a really bad mouth. And we listed all the things that you have to put in a baby's crib. And it's something like a pair of scissors. What else was there? 10 different things that were listed, a pair of keys, some wool. I can't remember the rest of them, but like there's just like all these different beliefs of things that were important to put in a baby's crib for the luck of the baby. And it just went on, and you're like, this baby's not any space in the crib.
Sounds something like the custom that survives on the wedding day, where you have to wear something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And probably because there was a huge percentage of child mortality, infant mortality, that would explain why there were so many things to be put in a crib, I guess. Yeah, folklore is lovely. Do you also tell in Welsh? Yes.
I only have a very limited Welsh. My Welsh in story is still kind of basically restricted to the random words and phrases I know, and I'm still constantly picking up new words and dropping them in the ways. Tan in the spell is the Welsh word for fire. Amser Maithon or is once upon a time. And there's incremental Welsh. I've been trying to learn Welsh for years, but I'm not very good at learning languages. And I haven't found the right space to go on a course that fits in with my hazard. I'm working now, I'm not working now. I tried Duolingo, but it got me somewhere, and then it didn't get me very further than that. It's the history of my family. My dad grew up in Wales. He's got a basic understanding of Welsh primary school, but again, it's very kind of phrases, sentences, not really. He couldn't hold a conversation in Welsh. And my Granny, my dad's mum, grew up in Barry, which is just down the road from us. But she grew up in a family just at the time when speaking Welsh was seen as a vulgar thing to do, and you weren't taught Welsh. She was never taught Welsh.
We heard from the Irish, Simona. Do you remember the Irish people who tell things like that about their language? When English was the imposed language for everybody, conquered by the English.
In some cases, it's funny because it was on one hand imposed. You had like the mines, for example, where some mining and other companies would ban you from speaking Welsh in the job. And then other places, like it was a kind of self-done. The middle classes often did it to themselves in the sense they wanted to ingratiate with the English middle classes and be seen as like better than all these. And so that Welsh became relegated to the language of the lower people, whereas we're respectable English-speaking middle-class folk. Please give us preferential treatment.
Yeah, and then when the English wanted to be respected, they would have to go French, right?
Yeah. Like the French go to Latin, and the Latin, they start speaking in Greek, and the Greeks start speaking in ancient Egyptian. The ancient Egyptians probably... Yeah, it's a funny thing. My granny always said that it was that kind of thing that she sort of regrets in her later life at 94, with sort of feeling this like, I never learned this language. But her mother and their family line went back into the valleys. There's a Welsh thread of that line of the family, but it stopped being about the language because of her parents.
Luckily, things are changing nowadays, and people are more embracing the native languages of the peoples who live in particular places, even in the UK, and hopefully globally, because it is a very nice thing not to lose your traditions and know where you come from. But let us put that aside for a minute, even though we are crazy about it, being linguists and all, Simona and I would like us to talk a little bit about your show. I emceed Kestrel at the festival at Get a Word in 8 Ways. By the way, this podcast is under Gawi's wing this season 2. They have adopted us. So in this very unique performance, it was my first experience of somebody talking through story about their personal struggle fighting their demons when we're talking about mental health issues. And I think this is exactly why it got so into me and the people who heard it.
Yeah, the show's called The Initiation, and it was very much an attempt to tell a 100% true story, which isn't something I've done lots of before. I tell lots of myths and legends and folklore and maybe an anecdote here and there, but this was 100% true. But the story I'm telling is my story of psychosis and the kind of journey of psychosis I went through 13 years ago, and it lasted 3 to 4 years. And the main part was the first 6 months was I was homeless. Xanthi Grisham said it to me when I performed it down her club, which was that some storytellers tell true stories and some storytellers tell myths, and some storytellers might put them next to each other and say, oh, here's a myth and here's how it relates to my life. But what this show is a real life story of myth. It's a myth, but it happened to me. Like, it's a very strange story because I go into the world of the psychosis and then I tell entirely the reality I thought I was in at the time. And I don't give you any real world context for what that means. So you're left kind of wondering points when gods appear and demons appear and spells are cast and the world, the hourglass of time gets shattered into 1,000 pieces. What does that mean in the real world? Because basically I tried to write it as a show 5 years ago now, hit a wall, got stuck because it was just so huge. I tried to write it a novel, hit another wall, got stuck, and then finally came back to writing it as a show. And the only way I could find to do the show in an hour that made sense was to just strip out everything that wasn't the world of this imagination that I went into, and then process it through that. So you go through this journey of the underworld journey. And I thought I'd gone down into the underworld. I thought I died. I committed kind of psychic suicide and then walked this path to this kind of first great spell. And there's 3 spells that pinpoint the different points of my journey. And the first one is all about the kind of the end of the world, the apocalypse, the doom. And then the next part was a journey out of that, kind of learning this magic. And I thought I was on this kind of path of like magical revolution. And some point I do all these spells right and the world would erupt into some sort of huge and wonderful revolutionary transformation. And at some point I split from the guides that I was with, the gods, and realizing that gods are dangerous and gods don't necessarily have our best interests at hearts, and they treat us like toys. I get a lot from Terry Pratchett. Anybody who reads Terry Pratchett will recognize the gods as I describe them. They play with us, and they don't care if the arms come off. And so I kind of went off on my own path and tried to find my own way, but getting back home is harder than going out there. And lots of people, when they're seeking enlightenment and spirituality, and people who experiment with meditation practices or drugs or go and take ayahuasca or whatever they do to try, and they think that they need to find something, you can go out there easily. It's very easy to go up. Getting back down is much harder, particularly if you haven't got a grounded practice to teach you. And the experience I had with psychosis was that the coming back was a lot longer than the going out. There's so much I could talk about this show. What do you want to know? Is there any questions you've got specifically?
When I chatted with you earlier and I told you we wanted this mentioned, you said that obviously you cannot give us the central point of this, even though we do get an idea of how this surreal narration occurs. But you said there are other stories of that time you could share.
There's sort of stories within the stories, and I'm still working on the ones I can tell as standalones, because there are a few stories that are just odd. When I look at the whole arc of the tale, I've just applied for Literature Wales funding to sit down and finish the book version. So I'm currently in the land of like drawing every single thread and every single memory back out. So they're kind of all dancing around my head at the moment. I could tell you a story if you want to hear a little. It's a story from that time, but it's not a story that appears in the show. If you watch the show, you wouldn't exactly understand how it fits because it doesn't. I had to make lots of choices when I made an hour-long show, and I had to cut things and change things. One of the things about psychosis is I've got multiple memories of the same events. I can remember it from a realistic perspective of being in the earth and just thinking things were weird. And then the weird things often present themselves from 2 different angles. "13 years ago, I went to the underworld. And sometime after I'd crossed the River Styx, the River of Oaths, sometime after I'd walked through the grey forest of the paths of the dead, sometime after the bridge of lamentation, the Cocytus, where all the sorrows of my life were stripped away from my body, I found myself stuck in a city called the City of Broken Dreams. And the City of Broken Dreams is basically a holding place for the dead, the souls that wait to be processed, to have their forms ticked and all their things stamped and sent on to their many different underworlds they go to. And my guide had gone missing. My guide was the god Mercury, and Mercury was apparently scouting ahead. And I was left in a warehouse, an abandoned warehouse. It used to be a carpet warehouse. The ceiling was asbestos. The floor was often flooded. It was the depths of winter. It was cold and icy. And lots of other lost people lived there. One night I was coming back to the warehouse. I climbed up the stairs and I went into this room, and this room was made out of pallets. And there was a girl that was staying in this room that I'd become really good friends with. And we'd stay up late and we'd chat and talk. And this one night she got to talking and she told me a story about her childhood. When she was a girl, she had this sensation like there was lots of voices always in her head. You know, there were always things talking, always chattering, and she always had someone to play with in her own mind. And that wasn't really a problem. You know, it's not really a problem having a constant imaginary friend. The problem was that she would get these visions of a thing, a wolf type entity, a beast, a terrible shadow just lurking in the corner of her eyes, just watching her, stalking her, getting closer and closer and closer. And she used to be terrified of this figure. She used to have nightmares about it. She used to wake up crying about it. And so her parents, they did the only thing that was rational to do, eschewing all forms of modern medicine. They took her to see a witch doctor. And the witch doctor, this is a true story, the witch doctor asked her questions and looked in her eyes and prodded her fingers and did whatever witch doctors do. And at the end of his investigation, he said, I know what's happening. You have 7 souls in your body. I'm going to do a little ritual and I'm going to ask 6 of those souls to leave and go find other places. I think that if we can get those other souls to leave, you won't be such a big magnet for whatever it is that's stalking you, and it should all be resolved. So that's what he did. He did this ritual. He asked one by one each soul to leave, and each soul left. And this girl, after that moment, was alone. Very, very alone. It was like quiet in her head all the time. And she didn't really know what to do with it. She didn't know how to deal with it. But though she was alone and she sort of felt empty and a bit hollow, the stalking presence, the wolf, also went. So she didn't have the nightmares, she didn't have the fear. So her parents at least thought she was cured. And I listened to the story, and it reminded me of a story that I just kind of recently heard and processed. So I sat and told her that story. In that cold, icy warehouse under the asbestos ceiling, I told this story. In the beginning, when the gods were young and the world was new, Artemis had 7 handmaidens, 7 wonderful, talented, beautiful handmaidens. And at that time, there was a man, a giant of a man, a hunter called Orion. And Orion came across these 7 handmaidens of Artemis one day when they were washing under a clear waterfall. And he saw them, and he wanted them. And so he went up to them and he decided to woo them one at a time. Each, he would speak deep words of undying love. And when he'd got their attention, when he'd caught their imagination with his passion, he would turn to the next, and to the next, and to the next, and to the next. And the handmaidens of Artemis, the Pleiades as they were known, they saw this. They said, no, you can't come to us and try and woo us all. You can't come to us and get our hearts and then walk on to our sisters. You cannot do this. No, we're not having this. And they rejected him together. Orion is one of the famous misogynists of classical literature. He didn't like no, and so he began to chase them. He began to hunt them. And this isn't a good story for the Pleiades. They ran and they ran and they ran and they ran through the woods, over the streams, and he hunted and he hunted and he hunted and hunted, and he almost caught them time after time. And Artemis, seeing what was happening, went up to Zeus and said, Zeus, look what your hunter is doing. He is harassing my handmaidens. Do something. Put a stop to this. And Zeus, also a famous misogynist, looked down and he saw what was happening, and he sighed and he waved his hands. And the Pleiades were turned into doves, flying away on white wings. There, he says, that sorted it. But it hadn't. Because Orion was a hunter and he had bows and arrows and traps and snares, and he would come across the doves, the Pleiades, as they were sleeping, and time after time he almost caught them. And Artemis went back to Zeus. Zeus, you have not sold anything. Your hunter is the problem. He's the one that is chasing my handmaidens. Do something about it. And Zeus looked. And he waved his hands. And the Pleiades were transformed into stars. 7 stars hung up into the sky, singing in the firmament. There, he says, he can't catch stars. And Zeus turned back to what he was doing. But Artemis was heartbroken. her handmaidens, who had done nothing wrong, had been punished for the actions of this man who could not take no for an answer. These poor girls were now cast beyond the edges of space, and she couldn't see them. She couldn't sing with them. They were not her handmaidens any longer. So Artemis went to Apollo instead, to her brother, told him what was happening, and together they concocted a plan. And they crafted a giant scorpion, armor like iron, with a great spear of a tail lancing above it, and they sent that scorpion down upon Orion while he was sleeping. And the spear of a tail stabbed, and the poison entered his body, and Orion died in agony. Now, Artemis thought that justice had been done, but Zeus, he saw what had happened, and he thought, that Orion, that's a man after my own heart, and we know what kind of heart Zeus has, being who he is. And so Zeus decided to reward Orion for his masculinity, and he placed Orion in the stars. And to this day, the hunter is still chasing the Pleiades around the heavens, and that cycle has not yet been broken. That's the story I told in the warehouse to the girl who'd been born with 7 souls in her body, born hunted by a strange force, a wolf, a terrifying thing that was getting closer and closer. Now, at that time, there'd also been a boy that had been courting this young girl, wooing her, getting into a relationship with her. But as soon as he did, he practiced very bad polyamory. He would go off then and court other people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other people. And any time that she said, "What are you doing?" and pulled away from him, he would be back and wooing again, wooing her, "Please, please be with me." But as soon as he had her heart, he was off again. Well, I heard the story of the Pleiades that I came and told, and I heard her story and saw what was happening. And in my eye, in my crazy eye back then, I saw a thread of word, a binding of fate repeating time after time. And so that night, in the darkness of the warehouse, lit by a single candle, I cast my spells, drew symbols, burnt them over the flame, whispered weird words, and it worked. At least, to my eye, it worked. Because the next day, that boy had to leave the city and never return. And I was born in November, and I am a Scorpio. But to this day, I don't really know whether it was me playing the part of the Scorpion, simply joining in with a dance that will go on and on, or whether I'd done what I wanted and broken the story and set the Pleiades free.
Wow, thank you.
So that's a story within a story. You'll hear the warehouse does come up in the actual initiation show, but that story is just kind of like one of the many strange events that happened during that time. And that is true.
So this is like a spin-off story from the condensed one that you tell during the show.
I grew up kind of atheist humanist, but I'd eaten loads of storybooks, so that when I went into the world of myth, suddenly I was in the world of classic mythology and polytheism and gods. And one of the things about a polytheistic psychosis as opposed to a monotheistic psychosis is that I've come across lots of monotheistic psychosis where people think they're Jesus and they're God, and there's one God, and that makes them really, really great, and their ego expels massively, and I'm really important, and you're all cattle to my grandness, and you must hear my wisdom. When you have a polytheistic psychosis where you believe you're a god or speaking to a god, all that does is open up the door to, there's loads of gods. Who else is a god? So you start seeing everybody you know as characters from myth. So you stay quite grounded, even though you're not grounded, but like you still treat everybody with a lot of respect, and you don't try and blow your own trumpet, because if you did that, then someone else would blow their trumpet even louder. And the girl in the story, at that moment, she was one of the Pleiades, but at different points in the story, she actually was Artemis. All my friends became different gods at various points. And sometimes I was looking at them for ages going, who are you? And there's lots of weird coincidences. Vulcan, Hephaestus, the forge god, was a friend I knew whose father was a blacksmith. He was a blacksmith. But interestingly, had a limp because someone stabbed him in a leg once. He was at a festival and St. Paul's Carnival, actually, and some kids just came up and stabbed him in the leg with a knife. It was some sort of like hazing practices where you've got to go stab someone to get your right in the gang. So he had a limp, and Hephaestus, Vulcan, has a limp. And also the person who was Venus was madly in love with him, which I didn't know until after I decided she was Venus. And there's this kind of little things that were like confirmation biasing my imaginary weaving of characters. There's quite a few more. That one's one that got a very contained story, and there's a lot of other ones that I'm still trying to decide what the contained story is before I tell them.
Can I ask you, Kestrel, how come you use Mercury's, the Latin name, the Roman name, for the god that supposedly was your instructor, but then you have Artemis and not Diana on the other hand?
I had to pick one for the show. I felt it made more sense to pick one name rather than many. Mercury was the name that came up most often. The amulet, which I described right at the start of the show, which was one of the main triggers for the whole journey, was the fourth pentacle of Mercury. It was named after Mercury, named after Hermes. But Hermes was a name that also came up at various points. And Odin also came up in the same thread. And actually, it linked itself all the way to Gandalf. Gandalf was, Tolkien acknowledged Gandalf was written after the character of Odin with the tall hat and the wizard where he walks in disguise. Odin was attached to Mercury, and that's why Wednesday in English is Mercredi in French, because Wednesday comes from Wotan. Wotan is Odin. They take the same role as magician and psychopomp in their various pantheons. I had to pick one, and so I didn't make any conscious choice about which gods were named after which things. It was the ones that stuck. In that story, it was very much Artemis at the time, so I picked Artemis again. We get references to Osiris. Some of them were very much more fluctuating, and then I just had to pick a name as a character. But I wasn't worrying about which language I was drawing from because the Psychosis drew from everything. I stuck much more to the classical mythology because that was the strongest part of my journey. But I had Ganesh, I had Shiva, I had everybody, any god you could possibly conceive. Chances are at some point in that journey, they played some part in my imagination.
You managed to draw yourself out of it on your own without medication, is that right?
Yes. Like I said, I lived in a forest community. Got there after the first 6 months of psychosis. I ended up moving into this community farm project in the Forest of Dean, which was a really amazing space because, you know, I built my own house. I built a bender, which is a very traditional old British type of house. You know, you just bend hazel poles into a dome like an upside down coracle, stick a skin on it. It was in a swamp, so it was on a platform. And I basically then had 3 years in the forest with a community which always did communal meals. The kitchen was entirely kind of donations and skipped food, so supermarket bins, getting all the food from there and going to the local markets and getting the leftover food. And people would do work days at one of the local organic farms and we get paid in huge amounts of food there. So we fed 15 to 30 people every night for 4 years entirely for free or for donation only. But that basically meant that I was in a psychosis, but I had my own little space to live in where I could just be my own crazy self. I had a forest. The Forest of Dean is an amazing place because you can just walk for a day and not see another human being. And there was always a meal. So I'd always have at least one meal a day, even in the depths of my thing. And one of the things that doesn't really come apparent in the show, because I'm only speaking to the psychosis journey, was that the first 6 months I was in it 100% of the time, but the rest of the period, there's this kind of transition between days where I was fully in the journey I was on and days when I'd be woken up from it. When you're in the psychosis, the real world feels like a dream that you've woken out of and you barely remember. And then when you're in the real world, the psychosis feels like a dream. There's this kind of bouncing back between one and the other experience that was actually what was happening. And the show, I just speak to the other world and not the real world that was happening in tandem. And the idea of coming back home was I couldn't stick in the real world. I'd still keep fluctuating from one to the other. And it was my process of finding the way to get stuck back into this world. There was a friend at the time who was also went through psychosis and got sectioned and got heavily medicated. And to my experience as an outsider, what it appeared like was it just cut off her connection to whatever was going on. It didn't solve whatever was going on. Yeah. And she's been sectioned twice more since then because she never actually developed her own practice of understanding what was going on in her head, recognizing when the symptoms were rising up, learning how to catch herself, learning how to ground herself. So the next time it all came up again, basically, as soon as she stopped taking the medication, she didn't have an inbuilt practice of self-awareness and meditation. I spent 3 years in the forest trying to build that, and storytelling has been part of that process of grounding myself.
I have conflicting opinions about that, because you made it and you're amazing. You're a role model to many people struggling with their inner demons. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has the ability to get there. You, of course, you give them this opportunity to try, and I get what you're saying, that we shouldn't rush into medicating a person that's going through that. This is exactly why your story is so important, and it should go out there so people would listen to it. But time is flying, and very quickly, could we please mention your brother's immensely impressive musical skill with putting this musical carpet beneath your story?
I had 2 weeks before the show. I did the first version of the show I did in February. He does digital sounds. He makes soundscapes and samples and beats and all sorts of stuff like that. And I just said, I want an hour-long piece, and I want it to basically be in 3 parts. And the first part sounds like this, and the second part sounds like this, and the third part sounds like this. And he went away and made it in the first week. And then I hadn't even properly rehearsed it at that point. So then at the end of the first week, I was like, now I've timed the whole thing. This is great, but the timings are all wrong, and that bit needs to be this long, and this bit needs to be this long. And he adjusted the timings for me, because it basically, the story has got 3 climaxes. The first section climaxes in, and then you go into the next section, and then the final bit, and he can create this piece of music. But it's very trancy. It creates this dreamlike atmosphere underneath the whole thing that I really like it. I've worked with musicians and we've crafted kind of music, and this is very different because it's just a constant, often quite drony. There's actually constant heartbeat through the whole thing. At the climaxes, the heartbeat actually speeds up. There's a thing about audiences, when we all listen to a story together, our heartbeats actually sync sometimes. And when you're actually all in the story, there's a whole study on how our heartbeats and even our neurological patterns can converge when we're collectively experiencing something in the same state of mind. So I wonder if that heartbeat is the audience is subconsciously tuning into that, so they're kind of naturally rising and falling with the emotion. His name is Jake Morton. He's got a YouTube channel. If anyone wants any soundtracks, we're currently working on recorded things. He makes very good soundtracks for recorded stories as well, because you can put in specific sounds at specific times, and because the thing's already recorded, you're not guessing where the storyteller is going to do it based on how fast it came out. It's been really useful for me, because I know that the soundtrack's exactly an hour long. And I know when I get to the climaxes if I'm going too fast or not. I'm like, I've reached this point, but I'm in the wrong place in the story. Then I just put the brakes on and go, okay, now we can just slow down and really appreciate this climax of music. And when I get to the end of the climax, I can go, okay, now I know I'm at the right place for this point. And then I go, I'm too fast or I'm too slow. And I'm like, okay, I've got to really speed up because the climax is coming and I haven't got to the bit that I need to. And I don't know if anyone else has this with their storytelling, but for me, I lose track of time. I have no idea what time.
And we're 4 minutes out of schedule, to be honest, talking about losing track of time. So Jake Morton is Kestrel's brother and producer of soundscapes, which really puts the people in that trance you're looking for while sharing a very powerful story. And as Kestrel pointed out, it helps a storyteller manage their time, because sometimes we do get carried away. So thank you, Kestrel, so much for this interview, for your time and your shared experience. We appreciate you a lot and wish you the best.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
There would be so many more questions to ask you, but let's keep it like this, and hopefully we'll meet one day and you'll tell us more about your experiences and storytelling. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day then. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.